Prepare to rethink everything you thought you knew. This is Mind Benders, your source for the most mind-twisting facts that will expand your understanding of the world. Let's bend some minds.
The hook and the enigma. What if you were told that your consciousness, that private inner world you inhabit every second of every day, is not a biological given? What if that inner monologue, the voice you use to weigh decisions, to reflect on the past, to dream of the future, is an invention? A piece of software installed in the human mind only a few millennia ago. This isn't a thought experiment. It is a profound, deeply unsettling theory that suggests our ancient ancestors did not think as we do. They did not possess introspection, self-awareness, or what we call consciousness. Instead, they experienced the world in a state we can barely imagine, a state governed not by internal deliberation, but by direct, auditory commands they believed were the voices of gods. Think of the oldest stories we have, the Iliad, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Old Testament. They are filled with passages where gods speak directly to mortals, not in dreams or vague portents, but with clear, unambiguous instructions. We have always dismissed these as poetic license, as metaphor. When the god Apollo commands Hector on the battlefield of Troy, we assume it's the writer's way of describing a sudden burst of courage. When God speaks to Abraham, we interpret it as a literary device to convey divine will. But what if it wasn't a metaphor? What if our ancestors, living just 3,000 years ago, literally heard these voices inside their own minds? What if their own thoughts, their own motivations, manifested as auditory hallucinations from an external divine source? This is the core of a theory so radical, it forces us to question the very nature of human history and the bedrock of our own identity. It suggests that the evolution of the human mind was not a smooth, linear progression, but a violent, catastrophic break. A moment when the gods fell silent, and, in that terrifying silence, humanity was forced to invent the self. The first clues emerge. In 1976, a Princeton psychologist and classicist named Julian Jaynes published a book that sent shockwaves through the academic world, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. The title itself is a challenge. Jaynes proposed that until roughly the first millennium BCE, the human mind was what he called bicameral, meaning two-chambered. Imagine your brain, not as a unified whole, but as a house with two rooms separated by a wall. In one room, the right hemisphere, novel thoughts, decisions, and stress responses are generated. But the person is not aware of this process. Instead, that signal crosses over to the other room, the left hemisphere, where it is experienced not as one's own thought, but as a voice, a command, an auditory hallucination. The right hemisphere was the God, the generating mind. The left hemisphere was the mortal, the obedient mind that listened and acted without question. There was no internal space for doubt, no "I wonder if I should." There was only the voice of the God and the immediate, unthinking execution of its command. Jaynes's prime evidence came from a meticulous reading of the Iliad, one of our oldest and most foundational texts. He points out that the characters in the Iliad show zero evidence of introspection. They never sit and ponder their options. They are never lost in thought. Their inner lives are completely externalized. Take Achilles. When he flies into a rage and is about to kill Agamemnon, he doesn't stop to think about the consequences. He doesn't have an internal debate. Instead, the goddess Athena physically appears to him, and only him, grabs him by the hair and tells him to stop. He obeys instantly. For Jaynes, this is not poetry. It is a startlingly precise description of a bicameral mind in action. A stress-induced command generated by the right hemisphere, experienced as the voice and vision of a goddess by the left. Throughout the ancient world, the evidence for this externalized authority is everywhere. Why were societies governed by oracles, divination, and the casting of lots? Why the absolute reverence for idols and statues of gods? Jaynes argues these weren't just symbols. For the bicameral man, the statue of a king in the town square wasn't a representation of the king, it was the king. its voice providing the necessary commands for social order. The gods weren't in some distant heaven. Their voices were immediate, personal, and lived inside the acoustic space of the mind itself. This mental structure, this bicameralism, provided societal control and stability for millennia. It built the first cities, the first empires. It was an incredibly successful, albeit alien, form of mentality. But it was fragile, and it was about to break.
Deepening the paradox. For this strange mental operating system to function, certain societal conditions were necessary: relative isolation, a rigid social hierarchy, and stability. But between 1500 and 700 BCE, the world was thrown into chaos. This was the era of the Late Bronze Age collapse. Massive volcanic eruptions, like the Thera eruption in the Aegean, blotted out the sun. Widespread famine led to mass migrations of desperate peoples. Trade routes collapsed. Complex societies like the Mycenaeans and the Hittites were wiped from existence. The world became a far more complex, chaotic, and unpredictable place. Jaynes argues that this unprecedented level of stress broke the bicameral mind. The two chambers of the mind, once working in concert, were thrown into disarray. The God voices, once clear and authoritative, may have become confusing, contradictory, or worse, they may have fallen silent altogether. Imagine the sheer terror. The entire psychological framework for your existence, the divine voices that have guided your every action, suddenly vanish. You are left in a deafening silence, adrift in a world of chaos with no internal mechanism to make a decision. This, Jaynes posits, was the crucible in which modern consciousness was born. Humanity had to develop a new way of thinking. In the absence of an external voice, we had to create an internal one. We had to create a narrative self, an I, that could simulate different outcomes, remember past events as part of a personal story, and navigate the world using a new tool, introspection. The evidence for this shift is written across history. Around this time, you see a dramatic change in literature. In texts like the Odyssey, written just a few centuries after the Iliad, you see a new kind of hero. Odysseus is cunning, he lies, he schemes. He has a rich, private, internal world. He is a man who thinks for himself. You see it in religious texts. The commanding conversational God of the early Old Testament becomes a more distant, abstract concept. Prophets, once hearing direct voices, now interpret visions and dreams. A new concept emerges, the soul, a private space of moral reckoning. You see it in the law. The Code of Hammurabi is a list of divine commands. If a man does X, the punishment is Y. But later legal codes, like the laws of Solon in Athens, are based on abstract principles and rational arguments. And you see it in art. The stiff, forward-facing statues of the Old World give way to the naturalistic, emotional, and introspective sculptures of classical Greece. For the first time, statues have a psychology. They look like they are thinking. Humanity was writing a new story for itself, a story where man, not the gods, was the protagonist. This wasn't just a cultural shift, it was a neurological revolution, a forced software update for the human brain, born from terror and silence. Part 4. The Promised Payoff Signal. Now, it's easy to dismiss this as a brilliant but ultimately unprovable piece of historical interpretation, a grand narrative that connects disparate dots. Where is the physical evidence? Where is the neurological proof that our brains were ever wired this way? It seems like pure speculation. But this is where the theory transitions from the pages of history to the cutting edge of modern neuroscience. The evidence for our bicameral past isn't just in dusty scrolls or crumbling statues. According to Jaynes and those who have followed his work, the evidence is still here. It's a ghost in our neural architecture, a remnant of a past cognitive structure that lingers in the very wiring of your brain. The bicameral mind didn't just vanish without a trace. It left behind echoes, vestiges that we can still observe today. These vestiges appear in moments of extreme stress, in certain mental illnesses, and in the very way our two brain hemispheres communicate with each other. The proof that we once heard the voices of gods is hidden in the strange dialogue that still occurs between the two sides of our own mind.
To understand the profound conclusion of this theory, we must leave the ancient world behind and enter the laboratory. We are about to uncover the ghost in the machine, the neurological signature that suggests our rational modern minds are built upon the ruins of an older, stranger consciousness. The scientific revelation. The human brain is not symmetrical. The two cerebral hemispheres, while appearing similar, are functionally specialized. This is known as brain lateralization. The left hemisphere is predominantly responsible for language, logic, and linear reasoning. It's often called the interpreter because it constantly constructs a coherent narrative out of the chaos of our experiences. The right hemisphere is more holistic. It's involved in spatial awareness, emotional processing, pattern recognition, and crucially, the generation of novelty. It sees the big picture, the forest for the trees. It is the source of our creative and intuitive leaps. Here is the crux of the neurological argument. In a modern, conscious human, there is a seamless, high-speed dialogue between these two hemispheres via a massive bundle of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. The right brain generates a novel idea or an intuitive solution, and the left brain immediately interprets it and integrates it into our conscious narrative as, "I just had an idea." But what if that communication pathway was different in our ancient ancestors? What if, as Jaynes theorized, the information from the right hemisphere was not integrated smoothly, but was instead dumped into the language centers of the left hemisphere? The result would be the perception of an external voice. The left brain interpreter wouldn't recognize the thought as its own, it would simply hear the end result as a command. This might sound speculative, but we see a haunting echo of this process in modern neurology. Consider schizophrenia. One of its hallmark symptoms is auditory hallucination, hearing voices that are perceived as external and real. Neuroimaging studies of schizophrenic patients during these episodes show a remarkable pattern. A burst of activity in the right hemisphere, particularly in areas analogous to the language centers, followed immediately by activity in the auditory cortex of the left hemisphere. It's a neurological pattern that looks stunningly similar to Jaynes's description of the bicameral mind. Is it possible that schizophrenia is not so much a disease, but a vestige, a throwback to an ancient cognitive state where the firewall between the two minds has broken down? Further evidence comes from split-brain patients, individuals who have had their corpus callosum severed to treat severe epilepsy. In these patients, the two hemispheres can no longer communicate. Researchers can present an image to only the right hemisphere, and the patient cannot name what they saw because the language centers in the left brain have no information. However, the patient can draw the object with their left hand, which is controlled by the right brain. When asked why they drew it, the left brain, the interpreter, will invent a plausible but completely false reason because it cannot admit it doesn't know. It creates a story to make sense of the action. This demonstrates the left brain's powerful innate drive to create a narrative, to be the I in control, even when it isn't. In the bicameral mind, this interpreter simply attributed the actions prompted by the right hemisphere to the will of an external god. Part 6. The profound conclusion. Let's pull all the threads together into the final mind-bending revelation. The theory of the bicameral mind suggests that consciousness, your sense of self, is not a biological imperative. It is a cultural technology. It is a piece of mental software that humanity was forced to write under extreme duress when our old operating system failed. Your inner monologue, that constant stream of chatter that you identify as you, is the learned replacement for the voices of gods. We learned to talk to ourselves because the gods stopped talking to us. We created an internal narrative space to navigate a
world that had become too complex for simple hallucinated commands. Every time you weigh a decision, you are reenacting the very process of creating consciousness. This theory reframes the entirety of human history. The rise of science, philosophy, art, and law was not just a series of good ideas. It was the direct consequence of a fundamental and traumatic shift in our cognitive architecture.
We are the children of that catastrophe, our minds forged in the silence left behind by the gods. But here is the final profound thought to leave you with, the one that bends the mind to its breaking point. If consciousness as we know it was invented only 3,000 years ago, what makes us think it is the final version? If our mental operating system has been updated once before, who is to say it won't be updated again? The world is becoming exponentially more complex, a storm of information and technology far beyond what our ancestors could have ever conceived. Are we, right now, living through the kind of stress that could trigger another breakdown, another catastrophic shift in the way we think? Perhaps a new post-conscious mind is already beginning to form in the deafening noise of our modern world. And if it is, what will it be like? What new gods or what new silence will it bring? The origin of your mind may be more alien than you ever imagined, and its future is a terrifying, thrilling, and completely open question.
The world is full of fascinating paradoxes, isn't it? We hope today's facts truly bent your mind. If you're ready for more daily revelations that challenge the norm, subscribe to Mindbenders. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a new video. Until next time, keep questioning.